Welcome to Conservation Fridays, where nature meets neighbor. I'm Jamie Lewis Hedges.
And I'm Rachel France. Today, we're honored to welcome Dan Zay to our podcast. Dan is the State Resource Conservationist at the Michigan Natural Resources Conservation Service, USDA, based in Grand Ledge, Michigan. With over a decade of experience in environmental conservation and project management, Dan brings a wealth of expertise to our discussion. His role involves managing the Ecological Services Section within the Michigan NRCS, where he provides leadership for the largest wetland compliance program in the nation. Daniel's work focuses on training and technology transfer to support sustainable agriculture and conservation efforts across Michigan. His extensive background includes serving as a state biologist, where he played a pivotal role in coordinating biological aspects of NRCS conservation programs and wetland compliance under the Farm Bill. With a passion for preserving natural habitats and wildlife, Dan's contributions to environmental conservation are truly commendable. Join us as we delve into his experience, insights, and vision for the future of conservation in Michigan.
Thanks for being with us, Dan.
Happy to be here today.
You know, I had the pleasure of meeting you at MDARD's habitat conservation training at Eaton County's Lincoln Brick Park.
Sure. It's one of my favorite little prairies.
That was an amazing spot, and I had not been there before myself. The training you were doing was looking at prairie restoration and prescribed fire management, and you walked us through that prairie restoration and helped ID plants and talk about their role in that. Really got me excited and interested in it, and thought I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to learn more about that. So it was a great training. Thanks for being willing to bring that to us today.
Yeah, that's one of a real gem in Eaton County parks. Jackie Blank is retired now, but she was a naturalist that been leading the management of that for over 20 years. And so it's a really nice, well-established prairie that just has a lot of lessons in one place to share on native grasslands.
Yeah, it does. I'd encourage anybody to go take a look at that when they have an opportunity to. So we're really eager to discuss wildflowers and wildfires with you today. But before we dive in, let's talk about volunteering. Rachel, are you a volunteer?
Yes, I am a volunteer. My husband always says I love to work for free, and I do. I mean, I work for cash too, but volunteering has always been a really important part of my life, from National Honor Society in high school to Girl Scouts to now. Something I'm really passionate about and enjoy.
Me too. And I think there's a really important role for that. Being a part of the community and being a part of efforts that you're passionate about. And I've been a volunteer at a number of places, as everything from being a board member to on the ground, getting my fingers dirty, planting trees, and have been involved in some really amazing adventures as a volunteer. And so we want to take an opportunity to encourage people, if you're passionate about protecting the environment, making a positive impact in your community, please consider volunteering with your local conservation district. By joining forces with your local conservation professionals, you'll support efforts in natural resource management that safeguard our communities. Whether it's tree wrapping, habitat restoration, water quality monitoring, or educational outreach, there are just countless ways to contribute to the preservation of our natural areas. Join our dedicated team of volunteers today and be a part of the solution for a greener, healthier future. To volunteer with Barry Conservation District, sign up at barrycd.org/give. That's barrycd.org/GIVE. Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. And we do have a lot of volunteer opportunities coming up very soon.
Yes, we do.
So Dan, you're here to talk to us about wildflowers in Michigan and maybe even the Midwest. Can you tell us about the role that wildflowers play in the greater ecosystem of our wonderful state?
Um, yeah. But prior to getting to that, if I could lay the groundwork a little bit on my background, just to kind of set the stage for my interest in wildflowers. As a professional, I've worked for the Indiana Department of Transportation managing roadsides and initiated a roadside wildflower program in cooperation with the DNR during my time there. And I worked as a regional ecologist for the Division of Nature Preserves and expanded my knowledge on wildflowers and native grasslands in the Midwest. Then as a consultant, I worked for 20 years doing wetland work and then started with the NRCS in 2013 as the state biologist, and then has moved to the State Resource Conservationist. But my interest in wildflowers and native grassland systems really grew out of my overall experience. But just in interacting with them in Indiana, and as I moved to Michigan, I just realized how impacted those systems have become over time, just through land use changes and agricultural and even suburban expansion. And so, and these, especially grassland systems, with their abundant wildflowers, are easily converted as opposed to woodlands that require a lot of effort to convert. So these systems can get degraded and go away real easily without folks knowing. So I have always taken my time to share with folks when I interact with the public on the importance of native grasslands to all the invertebrates that we love, like monarch butterfly, various other showy butterflies, and wildlife as well. But the role of wildflowers in ecosystem is really important as supporting the base of the food chain. The wildflowers provide pollen and nectar for invertebrates, which go on to become food for animals and maintain the base of the food web in ecosystems. The pollen is the protein component of food for invertebrates, insects, which supports reproduction in their life cycle. And then the nectar in wildflowers is the ready energy food component that they use for daily activities, moving around, foraging, that type of thing. And so wildflowers are really critical, and it's really important to understand what sustains and promotes wildflowers across the landscape to the betterment of all wildlife. I learned in the roadsides that over time, those systems have become very simplified because arguably the front lawn aesthetic had been misapplied to the roadsides. And so we got into the habit of mowing and spraying herbicide from fence to fence in the Midwest. And that impacted, a potential for literally hundreds of thousands of acres of grassland systems that could otherwise, provide a food base for invertebrates and provide connectivity across the landscape for those insects as well. So that's the big role of wildflowers in ecosystems. And of course, the public, people are drawn to them because of the showy petals and that are colorful, that attract the eye, but it also attracts the eye of the insects that feed on them.
So when you describe that, I'm wondering, maybe this is a reach, but I guess the appreciation for a post-apocalyptic in my brain, if it were possible to somehow arrest a role of wildflowers in our system, what would be the impact that we would feel as the average human being, or how long would it take to see that impact?
I mean, if we could leverage the amount or presence of wildflowers across the landscape?
Yeah, well, maybe the opposite. If all of a sudden there were no wildflowers.
Oh, well, unfortunately, we're actually seeing that there's a worldwide decline in pollinators and insects populations. And it's one of those real complicated issues because there's a lot of variables. But some of those variables roll out of the implications of climate change. But that's a real worldwide concern because those insects are the base of the food chain, and in large part they're impacted because of the unavailability of wildflowers as food source. Consider for a moment that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is on the cusp of considering listing the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly is a real charismatic butterfly species that everybody knows has a migration pattern that goes from the Midwest down to Mexico. But there's nothing unique about the monarch habitat except for its need for milkweed. And milkweed, the common milkweed, does not really require high quality habitat. A lot of your threatened endangered animal species and insect species, many of them require high quality habitats that get impacted. But here we have a relatively common butterfly species that has relatively ubiquitous habitat needs and utilizes a common weed for its larva development. And yet the population impacts that they're experiencing are, place it at the edge of being considered an endangered species in the United States. And that's a very troubling sign overall.
You bring that up about the milkweed, and I just was reading that there was a law passed in Michigan that's relevant to the milkweed.
I'm not specifically
I think it
aware of what
was.
it is. It could be that they're taking it off the noxious weed list.
That's correct. That was it. Yes.
That could well be. I mean, there was reasons for it to be placed on the noxious weed list, but with the advent of some herbicide compounds, milkweed has been, it's been easy to get to the point where it's not prominent within cropping areas anymore. The reason it was a persistent weed in crop fields is because it has a very deep taproot. So with conventional tillage, farmers were just cutting off the top of it and it would regrow readily and maintain its population in crop fields. And with the advent of effective systemic herbicide compounds in the 70s and 80s, that basically eliminated milkweed from being a problem in crop fields.
So with that, I know there are some programs for agricultural professionals to install things like pollinator strips. So I would think that having milkweed in and around your field would be beneficial as opposed to an issue. So,
well, it's beneficial for milkweed, and again, milkweed is not a problematic weed problem in croplands today. So, and it also, once it's eliminated from a field with conventional tillage, it's difficult to reestablish into a field because of its need to, take a couple of seasons to develop its deep taproot. So the idea that if you bring milkweed into adjacent pollinator planting or such, that you're opening up an avenue for, a redevelopment of milkweed as a crop field problem, it's not really a thing. But it has been suggested, but it's again pretty easy to control.
So you're here to talk about wildflowers and wildfires, which is really difficult to say together. But But can you tell us more about the impact of these wildfires on the wildflower populations?
Yes, and again, I'll be kind of deferring to native prairie remnants as a model for a lot of the discussion. In the Midwest, we had a lot of tall grass prairies were essentially on the eastern fringe of the wide open prairie areas of the Midwest. But the idea that prairies didn't exist in Indiana, Michigan, or Ohio is really a fallacy. Ecologists have identified for a long time that we had fairly large interstitial native grasslands throughout the Midwest. We have some large prairie remnants that have been identified. Michigan Natural Features has written quite a bit on them, and they also show up in pre-settlement accounts. But the round prairie down in Portage, Michigan, was one. The Big Prairie area up in Nuevo County was another. And we have various native prairies that existed at the time of settlement in the Lake Plain areas of the Saginaw Basin and also Western Lake Erie Basin. The impact of wildfires is unique in that in the Midwest, the history of wildflowers that maintained these grassland and wildflower systems. I'm going to trip over the wildflower thing myself. But they were maintained by Native Americans. The Indians brought their practice of landscape burning with them as the glaciers retreated. So Michigan has a unique ecological history of having our landscape modified frequently since the last ice age. And so all of our landscapes, have been touched by this, and the plant communities have arranged themselves in response to relatively frequent fire burning. And the Native Americans did this for a multitude of reasons. If you ask them, back in the day why they did it, they would ask you why not. What they were doing is maintaining the diversity and the abundance of the landscape to benefit their hunting and gathering opportunities. If you had a monotypic woodland, you would, gather and hunt woodland forest species and gather forest herbs and plants for your sustenance. But in a fire modified environment, you would basically expand your hunting and gathering opportunities by multiples, because you would have forested areas in areas that would be protected from the movement of fire. You would have oak woodlands that would be very productive and produce a lot of mast, which is real important food species for wildlife and humans at the time. And then you would have these open grasslands. So you would have basically three types of grocery stores, if you will, to pull from to sustain yourself. And so it was, an important part of their culture. They burned the landscape prolifically and frequently to sustain themselves. And it also, that type of fire, landscape fire, would bring in large ungulates, bison and elk after a fire, and even deer to browse on the newly renewed vegetation. So again, that was another benefit for the Native Americans. So wildfires out west can often be, the origin can be dry lightning strikes because of climatic conditions that support that. But dry lightning strikes in the Midwest and in Michigan were really not very common at all. In my travels and work, I've only seen one natural lightning strike fire, and it resulted in a 50-foot diameter circle down at Shade State Park in Indiana. Not that it doesn't happen, but again, the preponderance of landscape fire in the upper Midwest was anthropogenic.
Dan, what you're talking about is making me think about, there's been a lot more written now than than maybe a decade or 2 decades ago about not only the importance of burning, intentional burning in our landscapes, but I'm thinking about what was it, Charles Mann's 1491 and some other books that have been written about the whole idea of Western Europeans as they came to this continent, believing it to be this kind of static parkland environment, and not we suppressed fire for a long time, just trying to let things be. But what has been written about since with further research is that, some people have said that nearly the entire continent from east to west was anthropogenic, in the sense that it was human managed in some way, and fire being one of those key ways. Could you touch on that, and maybe briefly also touch on how did we finally go from denying that to now recognizing that fire suppression is not necessarily a good thing?
So you get a couple hours? No. No, you're exactly right. It's taken a long time for the scientists and public to embrace the importance of fire in Native communities. And, for good reason, they're developed a Smokey the Bear attitude. And even today, there's a big section of the population that doesn't or is very skeptical of the use of fire in the landscape. But there's just loads of evidence from ecologists and archaeologists and anthropologists about the use of fire in the landscape and the resulting landscape context and the health of the plant communities. It's really integral. Now, what has occurred, of course, is the vast development of the landscape to support our modern culture. But that makes it even more important to consider the use of fire in our remnant habitats, because you can change those remnant habitats irreversibly in the absence of fire. You can drive down the interstate in the Chicago area and see remnant black oak savannas and these mesocoque savannas where the canopy trees are widely spaced, and you can see that there's a 15 or 20-year growth of saplings underneath there, and there's daylight between the shrub growth and the canopy growth, and those are like that because of the absence of fire in those remnants. And likewise, but there is a very healthy volunteer and not aggressive, but a well-developed management effort in the forest preserve districts around Chicago to identify and manage those native habitats with fire. And the response of those plant communities to the reintroduction of fire is dramatic, and in the health and the distribution of native plant species and the abundance of wildflowers, et cetera. So we have all the evidence we need. A lot of it is the will to do what's right in some of these important plant communities.
So then there are people that are doing these prescribed burns where they're planning to burn, like, for example, at Pierce Cedar Creek, I've seen it done. I actually have a landowner of a shoreline restoration site who also burns. Can you tell a little bit more about how maybe the process of a prescribed burn? And we already kind of understand, hopefully now, the role of fire with the flowers, but why would you intentionally burn a landscape at a nature preserve or a restored shoreline, or even just a backyard pollinator lot? I don't know if you would do that, but
again, it's to reconnect this, even though it was largely anthropogenic in the past, the effects of the fire in the landscape resulted in a natural plant community response. And so in contemporary times, if you have a remnant that you're managing, if you're a park system or the DNR or Pierce, and even Fort Custer Training Center is doing quite a bit of prescribed burning. It's in response to the responsibility to identify these native plant communities and manage them, again, reconnect them to a disturbance protocol that, connects them to their history of development over time. You got to remember, again, I mentioned that fire was common, 10,000 years ago since the last ice age. And the suppression of fire is only, 150 years old, more or less. And so there's still an opportunity to restore some of these communities. Is it appropriate everywhere? Of course not. But with prescribed burn training and appropriate application of this tool, you can get tremendous results. And they're results that it doesn't take a scientific eye to see. The public that goes out there can see the difference between pre and post burn fire effects and get a quick appreciation for how dramatic the health and the restoration of the herb layer plant community is, and even the canopy plant community. So it's real important. The impact of wildfire on wildflower habitats is that you remove the duff layer, and you've heard people say, well, it's the heat that stimulates the regrowth, and it's not the heat from the fire. Matter of fact, in grasslands, you can walk barefoot across the burn area, within minutes after the fire goes through, because there's no fire retention, and the soil is a tremendous buffer for heat. But what happens is you remove that duff layer and you get sunlight down to that soil surface, and you start the machinery of the growing season activity, maybe 2, maybe 3 weeks extended over the course of the growing season. And when you remove that duff layer and you get that soil surface growing, you stimulate biological activity, you stimulate microbiology, all the rhizosphere activity that goes on, and you get a jump on other areas that aren't otherwise receiving prescribed fire. And so when you consider a plant's growth cycle over a given growing season, to add 2 or 3 weeks to that in a given year is a tremendous boost to the productivity of individual plants.
What's the difference? I did not realize what you just shared with us about removing that duff layer and getting the sunlight down in the soil, as opposed to the heat being the causal factor there. And what question that brings to mind is what would be the difference between that and doing intensive mowing, or going out and pushing back with equipment, pushing back the topsoil? Is there a functional difference between mechanical means and prescribed fire?
Yes, there is. That's a really great question. And there are areas where it's not feasible to do a prescribed burn, like a small prairie planting or something in and around structures or that type of thing. And you can get some benefits from mowing or even brush control, mechanical brush control. But those are really second tier management tools in comparison to prescribed fire. You just can't get the same effects that you can get with a prescribed fire. At one level, prescribed burning is a fairly blunt tool, but you can, by managing your prescription, get all kinds of variability built in there. You can burn maybe a day after a light rain or something, so you can get more of a mosaic burn, and that can provide a different effect. just all kinds of that things of that nature. So yeah, and the crux of that is when you're planning these diverse grass and wildflower plantings, is to consider the ultimate application of prescribed fire and put them in an area that you can build to be easy to burn. Now, you may not always have that option in a remnant where you're working with something that's extant, but when I see a CRP plan, for instance, where it has a prairie planting with wildflowers, pollinator habitat, and then they also place white pine scattered through there. I know from the onset that that's not going to be burned because they haven't developed it or planned it to be burned. And so, there's a distinction there.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the fire regime, about like how often these burns maybe should occur if you're prescribing them, or how often they might occur in nature to sustainably manage this?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that. Historically, grassland fires on the landscape probably occurred on a 1 to 5 year rotation to maintain the structure of a savanna where you have open grown oaks with interstitial grasslands. You can probably maintain that character with a 5 to 10 year return rate frequency. If like at Lincoln Brick, for instance, we were burning that fairly frequently, sometimes every year, and there's no reason to withhold fire. There was some discussion at the North American Prairie Conference maybe 15 years ago where they were making a case for not burning every year because of rare insects. Well, that has been challenged with some additional research in an area where they had to burn a remnant that was under a power line, and they found that they couldn't exclude those rare insects that were existing because of burning or through the use of fire, but those populations were at a little lower level. But when you're talking about a planting, the insects that you're providing habitat for are reoccupying that landscape from adjacent areas that have largely been disturbed. So you're working with a suite of insects that are fairly resilient to prescribed burning. And so again, you aren't going to eliminate them. A lot of times a burn rotation might be more practical because say you have a big area and you want to cut it into 3 pieces so you only burn a third of it every year, just from a practical management perspective. That's different than, for an ecological perspective. And that's, that's certainly a reasonable objective. And prescribed burning for an agency, a park system, or any entity, it's really a unique enough tool that if you're going to do yourself, you need to have people trained up to be able to do that. And then you need to have those folks deploy that activity on an annual basis just to keep their skill set sharp, right? Otherwise, you can acquire a contractor to come and do the work. But we do have a tremendous resource in the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council. That's a multi-agency group that gets together to promote training and access for prescribed burning in Michigan. And they have online resources for contractors that do burning, and they have online resources for what burning is and direct you to the National Wildland Fire Coordinating Group, and WCG, that provides online training for various activities in the burn community. They do have a suite of kind of entry level and high level trainings. Part of that system is to develop a cadre of experienced people that can be red carded and deployed to out west wildfires. So that's kind of 2 different tiers there. And with prescribed burning in the Midwest, we're generally looking at low complexity, low risk burning, which can be achieved with a modicum of training and an experienced burn boss.
I want to get into what, how people can incorporate native wildflowers and wildfire into their own properties. That we have kind of two categories of people that we think about in conservation work, one being large acreage landowners like agricultural and farmers. And you mentioned CRP earlier. Could you talk to them specifically right now that we've laid out the importance of native wildflowers and having those spaces? What opportunities are there for people who own large acres of land to incorporate wildflowers and wildfires into their property and see?
Yeah, I mean that's the really great thing about native grasslands is the benefits are very scalable. I live on less than an acre of land near Wacusta, north of Grand Ledge. And I've taken about a quarter of an acre of my property, and I've planted a prairie planting on it that has probably close to 50 different native grass and wildflower species. And I manage that with fire every year. I'm that guy in the neighborhood, but I do work with the Delta Fire Department and get a permit every year. But the example is that I'm the only guy in the neighborhood that has, I can fledge a couple of nestlings of red-winged blackbirds every year. I have a multitude of monarchs visiting my little area every year, and neighbors don't. But it can be done in a small residential area. I back up to a farm field, but which affords some flexibility there as well. And I respect the culture of the neighborhood. I have, a maintained front yard, so it's kind of business up front, party in the rear, if you will. But the neighborhood has a multitude of opportunities for other folks to do a similar thing and to provide habitats for insects up and down the neighborhood. And I would argue that if you're, mowing an acre of grass every year, that you're giving away some hours of your life that you aren't going to be able to get back. I never, people like to mow because it shows quick results, but if they step back and add it up, what hours it's taking to do that, carving a little bit off that and developing a little prairie planting for pollinators is a real worthwhile way to get enjoyment back in your life, have an interesting natural feature on your small residential lot, and gain hours back from an otherwise routine task. Now, where it comes to CRP, CRP is an agency USDA program that's deployed through Farm Services Agency that the NRCS provides technical support for. That originally grew out of a need to reduce impacts of farming suboptimal fields, farm fields that could easily erode or other things. And so we're basically getting over farmed areas, out of production and into a conservation cover. And it was a very low bar at the time. They were looking at just putting grasses on there, and then it expanded to native grasses. And then we identified over time that there's need for pollinator habitat. And so now there's pollinator opportunities in there. You could argue that when we first rolled out CRP, if we encouraged everybody to plant pollinator habitat, we might be in a better position nationwide with the impacts the impacts that we've seen to pollinators. Nonetheless, we are where we are, but there are opportunities to incorporate that through our CRP right now. And it's like anything. We provide an entry level opportunity to get pollinator habitat out there. But, producers or farmers, landowners who are really geeked and interested in this and want to maintain that habitat beyond the term limit of CRP can certainly do other things like supplement out of their own pocket for increased diversity in those CRP plantings. It should never be perceived as the end all. CRP is really an entry level for those type of objectives. And there are, two different versions of folks that are engaging in CRP, some to take land out of production that shouldn't be in production, get a farm bill payment. And then there's others that really want to convert this for long-term habitat. And those folks have opportunities to, jump above and beyond the entry-level CRP planting.
And earlier on, we were talking about prairie strips. That would be kind of in the middle there of the two. And can you explain those a little bit for those of us who don't fully understand that?
Yeah, that's a real neat concept, and it provides a lot of utility for various reasons. I haven't covered yet that these native grasslands, the grasses and the wildflowers are very deep rooted as opposed to Eurasian grasses. I mean, they start, their roots go down 4 to 8 feet or more at times, and so they're tremendously productive in terms of carbon sequestration because they reach down with their deep roots every year to get resources, water and nutrients. And then over the winter, they die back. And so those root fibers from the previous season become sequestered carbon. And they also develop soil structure doing that. And so there's a lot, they develop infiltration. About 3/4 of the biomass of these native plants is underground, and about 1/4 of their biomass is above ground. And that's a ecological adaptation over time to hedge against the periodic droughts that we experience in the Midwest. But, on a dry year, these prairie remnants will go out there, and where everything else will be brown, if you're talking fescue and bluegrass, these prairie grasses will be green. They might be a little shorter in that given year, but they'll be green because they have developed the subsurface. And when they're deployed in strips across production fields, you get the benefits of providing refugia for beneficial insects that can attack crop damaging insects. And then you get all the other benefits of improving the soil infiltration, improving soil health, providing barriers for runoff that'll intercept runoff and then try to infiltrate that. And so all those kind of things. And it's just, a producer can look at a nominal strip might be 40 feet wide. You could probably scale it up or down either way, but you can deploy these across a production field and get many benefits of having these native grasslands benefiting crops without taking a tremendous amount of field out of production. And so it's a relatively new, but holds a lot of really positive benefits for producers that want to innovate and try that type of thing.
Thanks. And we are in the final minutes, Dan, but I don't want to get away from here without asking you if you're familiar with and do you have, does this overlap, especially when you were talking about your yard and, having an acre, half an acre that you can do something with? You bring me to mind of Doug Ptolemy's work on Nature's Best Hope. Are you familiar with that? And
I'm not.
Okay. Then I'll pitch it myself. The book is Nature's Best Hope. It's gotten a lot of traction here recently. Dr. Doug Ptolemy has done a lot of work out of the University of Delaware on ecology, and the premise that he provides in that book and on his website, is that if people can set aside roughly half of their yard in gardens or the yard itself, and convert that to native natural landscape, that we can significantly, offset the impacts that we've brought for the environment and biosphere, and bring a lot of really good insect and everything that you've just described in this episode. We can bring those ecological actions right through our own yard. And I find that really a powerful notion.
Yeah, I think that's provides a lot of hope, and I think that's a pretty reasonable proposal. We get into these patterns of, managing our yard like we would, manage the interior of our houses. Everything has to be 3 inches in green. But if you can allow for a little different paradigm, I think, the everyday person would come to appreciate that. When I come home from work, the first thing I do during the growing season is get out of the car and go out and run around the prairie and walk around the prairie, actually, and look at every new little thing happening, because every day, even a little quarter acre, there's something new to see and enjoy. So I think that would be a real reasonable approach to engaging and giving everybody something that they can do, to an otherwise, insurmountable problems that we seem to be facing in terms of ecological health of our landscapes and even climate issues. So, yeah, I think that's a great recommendation.
Definitely. And I mean, even I also have less than an acre. I think I have maybe a third of an acre. And I haven't converted any lawn, or what is, it's really not lawn at all. It's more dirt. But I decided to do more of a manicured landscape in the front garden area, but I used all native plants because I was really curious to see how we could do this. And I also wanted to kind of advertise it in a way to show people like, hey, you can use all these native plants and it's still going to be beautiful, and you're going to have all these beneficial insects, and the rain is going to soak up faster. So I really love that. And I think it's something that the more people learn about it, the more they will adopt it and see the benefits themselves, and then at a larger scale. But
you make a real good point, and those native plants can be used in more of an ornamental context. What you may find is their ecology is such that they're used to a real aggressive, competitive root zone in their native context. And when you use them ornamentally, they tend to be a little leggy, because that situation lacks that competition in the root zone. So, but with a little bit of pruning and some other techniques, that you can still be very successful with it. But some of these are very showy and very unique plants that you don't see anywhere else. Things like bottle gentian and queen of the prairie, any number of things. But one thing that's really important that I haven't made a pitch for yet is that the need for availability and use of local genotype. We have some species that have a broad range, and warm season grasses from Kansas perform differently than big blue stem and Indian grass from Michigan genotype. Same thing with the wildflowers. They perform differently, and we're setting up a scenario where you might have a mismatch with the wildflower performance and the emergence of the various insects that need those resources. So we'd be kind of lying to ourselves about the benefit. It looks real showy, but if there's a mismatch with the life cycle of the insects that need those resources, you might be setting up a scenario where it looks pretty, but it's not getting the most impact. And that's a challenge, because it's a real nuanced bit of information in the use of natives. But people need to understand that, and as much as they can, work with local suppliers. My foundation seed collection was what started what is now the Stantec Native Plant Nursery down in
Oh,
Walkerton, Indiana. I worked with JF New to build that up, and it's certainly gone above and beyond what I originally envisioned. But it's those types of initiatives that need to be replicated, so we have more and more of that plant material available.
definitely. Dan, I think that you and I could probably talk flowers and grasses for days, but
We're coming to the end, I suppose.
yeah, we gotta close it out. So thank you so much for being here and talking to us.
Thank you.
I really hope that we'll be able to work together more in Berry County specifically, because that's our county.
Certainly.
But and beyond, you know.
Keep me in mind, because I'm looking ahead to retirement in the not too distant future, and that will allow me to focus on stuff that I love full time, which is this. And so it's been a pleasure talking with you both today, and I hope everybody who's able to check this talk out to get some inspiration and moves together with native plants.
Indeed. Next, we will be talking with Catherine Getty from Blue Zones about parks, trails, recreation, and food initiatives. So please join us right here on Friday, May 3rd. And thanks for being a part of Conservation Fridays.